I don't know when I first noticed the silence between us. Maybe it was one of those quiet evenings when she came home late from her yoga session and walked straight past me. Her gym bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes avoiding mine like I wasn't even there. She would smile faintly, the kind of smile you give a neighbor, not a husband, and then disappear into the bathroom. I used to think it was exhaustion, that the stress of life was chipping away at her softness. But now I think I knew better, I just didn't want to see it. For years I had worked tirelessly, building a business, chasing contracts, flying across states to close deals that would secure our future. I thought I was doing it for us, but somewhere in that timeline of sleepless nights and boardroom wars, I had unknowingly left her behind. She was always supportive, always understanding, or at least I assumed so. I never asked. I just expected her to be there. When she first signed up for yoga classes, I was relieved. She had been complaining about lower back pain and stress, and I thought it would be a good outlet for her. "It helps me relax my body," she had said once, her voice tired but sincere. I remember nodding and going back to my laptop, barely registering the way she looked at me, as though trying to read something behind my eyes that I wasn't ready to show. Over the next few months, yoga became her sanctuary, 3 times a week at first, then 5, eventually almost every evening. She would come home glowing, hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, a subtle scent of lavender clinging to her clothes. I would watch her from across the room, wondering who she was becoming. She moved with a lightness I hadn't seen in years. Her posture changed, her moods lifted, but the space between us only grew wider. I told myself not to be paranoid. She wasn't doing anything wrong, she was just happy. Isn't that what I wanted? But there was something unsettling in how carefully she guarded her phone. She began locking it. She took it to the bathroom, and she never left it charging unattended like she used to. I once caught her smiling at a text and turning the screen away as I walked in. I wanted to believe it was a message from a friend. Maybe it was, but the seed of doubt had been planted. One Friday night, I came home early from a business dinner. I had skipped dessert just to surprise her. I even picked up her favorite matcha smoothie from that overpriced organic place she liked. The apartment was dimly lit when I entered. Her yoga mat was still unrolled in the living room, a small candle burning next to it, its flame dancing like it had a secret to whisper. But she wasn't home. She came in 20 minutes later, flushed and breathless. She laughed off her lateness, saying class had run over. I handed her the smoothie and tried to hide the way my hand trembled slightly. I didn't ask her why there were 2 empty cups in the sink or why the candle looked freshly lit. I just smiled, kissed her cheek, and told her to rest. But that night I didn't sleep. I lay awake next to her, her back turned to me, her breathing slow and even. I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I had become a stranger in my own marriage. The next morning I noticed she had changed her phone's password again. I didn't say anything. I told myself if I had to break into her phone to know the truth, then I had already lost her. Instead, I began watching more carefully. I noticed how she dressed differently before class now. Fitted tops, subtly applied lip gloss, a spritz of perfume behind her ears. I noticed the small things, the fresh polish on her toenails, the new pair of yoga leggings that hugged her frame just right. These weren't things she did when we used to go out for dinner. They were small changes, but they carried weight, intent. She became more evasive with her schedule. "I might stay late today," she would say, "extra stretching session." "My body feels stiff," and always that phrase, relaxing my body. It began to sound rehearsed, like a line from a script she'd memorized. One evening, I pulled into the parking lot of the yoga studio unannounced. I just wanted to see her, maybe surprise her with a coffee. I watched from a distance as the students filed out. A few chatted outside, some got into their cars, and then I saw her. She was standing by a sleek black motorcycle, laughing at something the instructor, a tall, lean man in his late 30s, was saying. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. She smiled, placed her hand on his chest briefly, then climbed onto the back of the bike. My stomach turned to stone. I didn't follow them, I couldn't. Instead, I drove aimlessly for hours, past the highway exits, into the night, trying to tell myself I had imagined it. That maybe it was all innocent, but my gut had already made up its mind. Back home, she was already in the shower. She hummed softly, a tune I didn't recognize. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the gym bag she had dropped on the floor. I wanted to unzip it. To look for something, anything, that would confirm what I feared. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I stared at the closet door and wondered when our home had stopped feeling safe. The next few days passed in a blur. I buried myself in work, staying late at the office just to avoid coming home too early. I started looking at her with new eyes, scrutinizing every smile, every "how was your day?" every touch that now felt foreign. She didn't notice my growing detachment, or maybe she did and didn't care. Then came the message. It was from an unknown number. No words, just a video file. I hesitated before opening it, heart pounding like a drumbeat in my throat. The video was shaky, clearly taken from a hidden camera. It showed the yoga studio after hours, dim lighting, quiet music, and then her and him alone. I didn't watch it all. I couldn't. I shut my phone and sat in silence, feeling the air leave my lungs in one slow exhale. The room felt smaller, the walls closer. I stared at the blank TV screen, seeing only the images burned into my mind. My wife. The woman I had built a life with. Trust was a fragile thing. Once cracked, it didn't shatter all at once. It splintered slowly, quietly, until it was irreparable. I didn't confront her, not that night, not the next. I needed time to think, to feel the full weight of what I had just witnessed. Rage battled heartbreak in my chest, and the only thing stronger was the ache of betrayal. She had said she was relaxing her body. And maybe she was, but at what cost? That weekend, she left early for a wellness retreat. I didn't ask questions. I just nodded and watched her leave, suitcase in hand, eyes bright. She didn't look back, and for the first time, I didn't hope she would. I sat alone in the quiet of our apartment, the stillness now a reflection of the emptiness between us. It was no longer about the yoga coach. It was about everything that led us here, the neglect, the assumptions, the unspoken resentments, the love we stopped nurturing, the wounds we never tended. I thought I had done everything right, provided, protected, built a future, but I had forgotten to be present. I had forgotten that hearts don't stay loyal out of obligation. They stay when they feel seen, heard, loved. And now all I had were questions. About her, about us. About whether what we had was ever real at all, or just a fragile illusion we both pretended to believe in. In the days that followed, I began to move like a ghost through my own life. Every routine felt hollow, like an echo of who I used to be. I went to work. I returned home. I kept up the appearances of a man holding it all together, but inside I was unraveling by the minute. There was something deeply cruel about pretending you were fine when your world had shifted on its axis. I smiled when people smiled at me. I nodded during meetings. I even laughed once, but it never touched the part of me that mattered. Sleep became a stranger. At night, I lay awake listening to the creaks of the building, the distant hum of traffic, the nothingness that used to feel comforting. My thoughts were relentless, turning over the same questions like stones in a river, wearing down whatever clarity I had left. I didn't want to be this man, the kind who obsessed over betrayal, who scrolled through his wife's social media for clues, who replayed that video in his mind over and over again like a self-inflicted wound. But I couldn't help myself. Hurt has a way of consuming every rational part of you until all that's left is instinct and ache. I told no one, not friends, not family, not even my therapist who I hadn't seen in months. There was shame, of course, this gnawing sense that I had failed not just as a husband, but as a man. I had let things rot right under my nose while I was busy polishing the surface. I had missed the cracks, or worse, ignored them. I started avoiding mirrors, not out of superstition or fear, but because I didn't recognize the man looking back at me. There were shadows under my eyes now, darker than they had ever been. My shoulders slumped forward like I was carrying something invisible but unbearable. My clothes hung differently. I wore the same shirt 3 days in a row once, and no one noticed, including her. Maybe that's what hurt most, how easy it was for her to not see me anymore. When she returned from the retreat, she was glowing, her skin tan, her spirit light. She brought back herbal teas and exotic oils, souvenirs from a place I never asked about. I watched her float through our apartment like a woman untouched by consequence. She kissed my cheek absently as she walked past, humming a tune I didn't recognize, like she had found a version of herself that no longer needed me. I stayed quiet, still, observing. I didn't want confrontation, not yet. I needed time to understand what exactly I was mourning. Was it the betrayal, the trust, or simply the illusion I had so carefully built about our marriage? One night, while she slept beside me, I opened my laptop and typed her yoga coach's name into the search bar. I found his website easily enough, a sleek, curated facade with glossy photos and testimonials from clients who praised his healing energy and intuitive hands. I studied his face, the smug serenity, the perfectly tousled hair, the lean arms folded over a chest that looked chiseled out of granite. Everything about him was curated to disarm and attract. He wasn't just a coach, he was a brand, a lifestyle, a fantasy. I closed the page. It wasn't worth feeding the fire. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily she had fallen for it, or maybe how desperately she had needed to. Maybe the cracks in our marriage weren't just mine. Maybe we had both built a prison of routine and silence and called it love. Maybe she was just the first one brave, or reckless enough to run. But even if she had reasons, I couldn't erase the fact that she had made a choice to lie. A choice to leave me alone in our bed while she sought comfort elsewhere. A choice to abandon vows we once whispered to each other in trembling voices, in front of people who believed in us. I began cataloging her patterns, when she left, where she went, how long she stayed. I wasn't proud of it. It felt like something a version of me I never wanted to be would do. But pain has a way of making you unrecognizable to yourself. And I needed to understand her world, the one she had constructed outside of ours. One evening, she told me she'd be attending a private group session at the yoga studio. I didn't answer. I just nodded, my eyes on my phone, pretending to scroll. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed at a distance. I parked across the street from the studio. The lights inside were dim, ambient, the way she always described. A few silhouettes moved behind the drawn curtains. I sat there for nearly 2 hours, staring at the entrance, waiting for something, anything, that would make sense of this chaos. When she finally emerged, she wasn't alone. He was there again, walking beside her, hand resting lightly on her lower back in that intimate, possessive way that made my fists clench. They laughed. He said something that made her toss her head back in amusement. I hated that laugh, not because it was ugly, it was, but because it was real, and I hadn't heard it in so long I had almost forgotten what it sounded like. She didn't come home until after midnight. I pretended to be asleep, but I heard her shower. I heard the rustling of her clothes as she slipped into bed beside me. I felt the slight dip of the mattress, the warmth of her body inches from mine. But she was a stranger now. A beautiful, unknowable stranger with secrets stitched into her skin. I needed a plan, not for revenge. Not even for confrontation. I needed clarity. I needed to know what the end of something really looked like when you were the one still standing in the ruins. The next morning, I reached out to a friend from college, a private investigator. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I remembered he specialized in discrete cases. We met for coffee in a quiet part of town. I told him what I knew, what I had seen, what I suspected. I handed over photos, names, timelines. He didn't judge. He simply nodded and promised to find the truth I already feared I knew. In the week that followed, I moved through life like a man underwater, every sound muffled, every breath an effort. She continued her routine like nothing had changed. Morning meditations, acai bowls, glowing Instagram stories about balance and inner peace. I watched it all from the periphery, unsure whether to be angry or amazed. The investigator returned with more than I had expected. Photos, conversations, transaction logs. There was evidence of rendezvous at hotels under fake names. Receipts for expensive spa treatments. Venmo transfers with suspicious emojis. My wife wasn't just having an affair, she was funding his life. It hit me harder than the video ever could, not because of the money, but because of the intimacy it implied. This wasn't a fling, this was something sustained, something nurtured. While I had been fighting to hold our life together, she had been investing in another one. I sat in my office that night, staring at the photos, my hands trembling. There was one of them on a balcony at some coastal resort. She was in a white dress, barefoot, laughing as he held a glass of wine to her lips. The sunset behind them was perfect. Cinematic, and in that moment I felt something inside me collapse. It wasn't jealousy or even rage, it was grief. A deep, primal mourning for the life I thought we had. For the memories I now questioned. For the years I had given so freely, so stupidly. I closed the folder, turned off the lamp, and sat in the darkness for what felt like hours. I thought about confronting her. Screaming, demanding explanations. But what would that change? The truth was already a jagged shard lodged deep in my chest. Eventually, I stood and walked to the bathroom. I stared at my reflection. The man in the mirror looked older than I remembered. Tired, but something had shifted. There was resolve now. A cold, quiet strength that comes when you realize you've hit the bottom and there's nowhere to go but up. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't destroy anything. I just stared into my own eyes and made a silent vow. This ends on my terms. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy my marriage. It wasn't that clean. It wasn't dramatic. The truth is far more ordinary than people like to believe. The end of love doesn't arrive like a thunderstorm. It seeps in like fog, quiet, consistent, unavoidable. After I saw the photos, after I read the transfers and studied the timestamps, something inside me didn't just break, it reorganized. My pain hardened into clarity, my grief became purpose. I stopped thinking of her as my wife. I started seeing her as someone occupying space in a story that no longer belonged to both of us. She had written new chapters without me. Now it was my turn to write the ending. The first thing I did was detach. Not physically, I still came home every night. I still made coffee in the morning and watered the plants on the balcony. But mentally, emotionally, spiritually, I left. I stopped reaching for her in bed. I stopped reacting to her manufactured stories about her day. I no longer asked where she had been or when she would be home. She noticed, of course. She tilted her head when I didn't kiss her goodnight, lingered in doorways like she expected me to ask what was wrong. But I gave her nothing. I became the reflection of the silence she had built between us. She didn't push, that was the most telling part. There were no midnight accusations, no teary demands for connection. She let me drift away with the same nonchalance she once reserved for forgetting our anniversary. That was the real betrayal, not the body, not even the money, but the apathy. The quiet, surgical extraction of love from our lives without so much as a whimper. I began preparing my exit like a man planning a clean assassination. Precise, detached, efficient. First, I called my financial advisor. We worked together for years. He didn't ask questions when I requested a discreet reassessment of all joint accounts. We began slowly separating assets, shifting ownership structures, creating buffers. I had no intention of stealing from her or leaving her destitute. I simply wanted the cleanest break possible, one that couldn't be weaponized later. I opened a private account, moved certain investments. I even redirected my salary into a new LLC under my name. Quiet moves, invisible ones. Then came the legal groundwork. I contacted a divorce attorney, not the loud kind that made headlines, but someone surgical and precise. We met in a modest office above a bookstore. I handed over every document I had, the video, the photos, the transfers, the hotel receipts. He flipped through them with clinical detachment, nodding occasionally. "You're being smart," he said. Gave it back. When the doorbell rang at 3:12 p.m., she answered. I heard her thank the courier, close the door, open the envelope. Then came the silence. Heavier than anything we had shared in months. I stood in the hallway, waiting. She walked into the room, holding the papers like they might explode. Still, I said nothing. I left that evening. No suitcase, no dramatic exit. I had packed my essentials weeks ago and kept them in the trunk of my car. I booked a room at a modest hotel, not to run away, just to give the fire room to burn itself out. That night I lay in a strange bed under strange sheets in unfamiliar air, and I finally slept. Not restlessly, not with dreams of betrayal or rage. I just slept, because for the first time in a long time I had nothing left to carry. The first night away from home passed like a slow exhale. No alarms, no footsteps, no cautious breathing in the dark. The walls didn't carry her perfume, and the sheets didn't remember her warmth. It should have felt lonely. Maybe in some ways it did. But mostly it felt clean, like stepping out of a storm and realizing how long you'd been soaked. I didn't cry. I didn't scream into a pillow or pour whiskey down my throat like some tragic hero from a film. I just sat there, cross-legged on a bed that wasn't mine, staring out of a window overlooking a half-empty parking lot, feeling something. I hadn't in years space, not freedom, not quite yet. But space, breathing room, a buffer between the past and whatever was supposed to come next. Mornings at the hotel followed a rhythm of their own, lukewarm coffee from a vending machine, a quiet lobby with muted television chatter. Men in suits checking out before dawn, women with tired eyes clicking across the marble floor in heels. No one looked at anyone. That kind of anonymity became a strange comfort. For once, I was the husband. I was her partner. I was just a man in room 302, minding his own business and letting the world pass. I rented a temporary workspace in a small co-working hub 3 blocks away. It had gray walls, bad lighting, and internet that barely worked, but it gave me a desk, and that was enough. I threw myself into work like it could save me. Emails, numbers, reports. I dove into data the way drowning men claw at the surface. Not because I loved it, but because it didn't ask anything of me. It didn't lie, it didn't betray, it simply existed. I told no one where I was. My parents thought I was on a business trip. My colleagues didn't ask questions, they knew better than to poke. My friends, well, we hadn't talked deeply in years. That's the thing about long-term relationships. You invest so much into one connection that others quietly dissolve in the background. You don't notice it happening until you reach for someone and realize the shelf is empty. A week passed before she reached out. Not through a call, not even a message, just a single email. No subject line, no dramatic wording, just a brief acknowledgement of the papers. Her tone was calm, restrained, like someone writing a customer complaint instead of replying to the death of a marriage. That made it easier somehow, easier to continue walking forward without glancing back. But if I'm being honest, there were moments when her absence carved into me, not in the way you'd expect, not with longing, but with disorientation. Years of routine don't unravel cleanly. They come undone in strange ways. I would reach for an extra coffee mug in the morning before remembering there was no one else. I would glance at my phone after work expecting a check-in that never came. It wasn't heartbreak. It was muscle memory refusing to admit its job was done. I spent more time outside during those weeks than I had in years. I walked through parks, sat on public benches, observed people with a kind of quiet fascination. Couples holding hands, teenagers blasting music, old men playing chess with scowls of focus. Life moved around me like a stream, and for once I didn't feel responsible for directing its flow. There was a particular Sunday afternoon I won't forget. The sky was smeared with gray clouds, heavy with indecision. I found myself at a small community garden near the edge of the city. Children were planting flowers under the watchful eyes of volunteers. A woman was teaching them how to pat the soil down, how to water gently. I watched them for an hour without realizing time was passing. That night, I returned to the hotel and stared at the ceiling, wondering how many moments like that I had missed. Not the grand vacations or milestone dinners, but the small pauses. The quiet beauties. I had spent so much time chasing success, controlling outcomes, maintaining order, that I'd forgotten how to be still. And perhaps in my stillness she had found another rhythm, one I never listened to. There was bitterness in that realization, but also truth. The divorce moved forward, cleanly, mechanically. She didn't contest anything. No arguments over property. No pleas for second chances, just digital signatures and email acknowledgments. It was almost surgical in its efficiency. And that hurt more than I admitted, not because I wanted a fight, but because I wanted to matter enough to be fought for. I started therapy again. The first session was awkward. I had forgotten how to speak about myself without editing. I told the therapist the facts: marriage, betrayal, silence, departure. She nodded, scribbled, asked questions that made me shift in my seat. But slowly, week by week, I peeled back layers I didn't know I still wore. I talked about my need for control, My fear of failure, my tendency to disappear into work when emotions felt too heavy. I talked about the distance that formed long before the yoga coach ever entered our lives. I admitted to the nights I came home and deliberately kept the television loud, so I wouldn't have to ask how her day was. I confessed to the way I used ambition as armor. I didn't excuse her, but I stopped painting her as the villain in a story where I had been merely passive. Growth is uncomfortable like that. Around the fourth session, I was asked a question that stopped me cold. What do you want now? Not from her, not from the past, but from yourself. It was the first time in months I didn't have an answer. So I started looking. I found it in places I didn't expect. Small cafes with unfamiliar music, old bookstores that smelled like paper and time, side streets. I never noticed because I was always in a rush to be somewhere more important. I found it in solitude, in the absence of responsibility, in being a man again, not a role. I even started writing, nothing formal, just thoughts, observations, scribbles in a cheap notebook I kept tucked in my bag. Some days the words came in floods, other days they trickled out like reluctant guests, but they were mine, honest, untamed. And they reminded me that I still had a voice beyond silence. Eventually, my lawyer informed me the divorce was finalized. I was now legally and emotionally unattached, free. The word didn't hit me with fireworks. It landed with a quiet thud, like the closing of a door I'd already walked through. She sent no goodbye, no last message, no apology. And I didn't need one. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a favor to her. It was a way to stop dragging her ghost through every room I entered. I didn't have to forget what she did. I just had to stop letting it define what I became. That night I packed up my things from the hotel and drove, nowhere specific. I just drove until the city lights thinned, and the road opened up like a wound healing in reverse. I stopped at a diner off a quiet highway, ordered black coffee and a slice of pie, sat in a booth surrounded by strangers. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. There's something strange about returning to a place that once held your entire life and realizing it no longer recognizes you. That was how it felt, standing in front of the apartment she and I had shared, know that I had left. The bricks were the same. The windows still stared blankly at the street. But whatever thread used to tie me to that threshold had snapped quietly in my absence. I hadn't returned to see her. I didn't need to gather belongings. I had already started over elsewhere. What I wanted, what I needed, was closure that had nothing to do with documents or signatures. I needed to face the shell of a life I had shed. I needed to see it one last time to make sure I never went back, even in thought. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't expect her to be home, and even if she was, it didn't matter. I stood across the street beneath a leafless tree, watching the building like an archaeologist watching ruins from afar. I half expected memories to flood back. Our first night after moving in, our fights over furniture, her laughter in the kitchen when we burned our first homemade pizza. But none of it came with emotion, just flickers, data without soul. She and I had filled that space once, but only with shadows toward the end, and now even the ghosts felt gone. I turned and walked away without glancing back. My new place was small, minimalist, and mine. A one-bedroom condo with tall windows and not much furniture. I chose every piece deliberately, clean lines, neutral tones. Nothing with shared history. It felt like a canvas waiting to be written on, not with another relationship, not yet, but with who I was becoming. Not a husband, not a betrayed man, just me. In the weeks that followed the finalization of the divorce, I experienced time differently. Mornings weren't rushed. Evenings weren't loaded with expectation. I moved slower, more deliberately. I learned to listen to silence again, not as punishment, but as presence. I realized how much of my life had been spent in reaction, responding to needs, adjusting to moods, managing emotions that weren't mine. Now, with nothing left to manage, I had to confront the person beneath the task list. Some days I found peace in the smallest things. A perfectly made omelet, the light slanting through the window just right, the sound of traffic fading at midnight. Other days I found myself swallowed by emptiness I couldn't name. Grief doesn't vanish when you sign papers. It lingers, wears new clothes. It shows up in quiet moments, An empty closet, a song in a grocery store, a memory triggered by scent. You don't cry, you pause, you breathe through it, you keep moving. Therapy continued to be my anchor. I unpacked layers I hadn't realized I'd buried so deep. Childhood wounds, perfectionism. My need to be the stable one, the man who fixed things, the man who never asked for help. I began to see how that persona had left no room for vulnerability, backslash. And when I finally needed her, needed anyone, I had no language to ask. I had taught myself to be a wall, and she, tired of knocking, eventually turned away. It was easier to blame her at first. Infidelity makes that simple, clean, but real healing isn't clean, it's messy, uneven. It requires ownership, and I took it slowly, painfully. I forgave her not as an act of virtue, but as an act of release. She did what she did. I wasn't perfect either. The end didn't need a villain, it needed honesty. I found myself walking more, long walks without direction. City blocks became therapy. I'd pass by cafes, watch people through windows, wonder what stories they carried behind their smiles or slouched shoulders. I stopped judging, I stopped envying, I just observed. One afternoon, I found a used bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a Korean barbecue. It was dim and quiet, shelves taller than me stacked with books that smelled like dust and stories. I spent hours in there, flipping pages I had no intention of buying. I eventually picked up a worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea. I had read it in school but remembered nothing. That night I read it cover to cover. It was about struggle, dignity, and loss, and somehow I felt Hemingway had written it for me. I started writing again, too, real writing, not just scattered thoughts in a notebook, but reflections with shape and voice. I didn't plan to publish them or even share them. They were for me. For the man who had spent so long holding his breath in someone else's life that he forgot what it meant to exhale his own truth. There was one entry I returned to again and again, a letter I never sent. To her, not to accuse or explain, but to say goodbye properly. Not with bitterness, not with a score to settle, but with a strange, quiet gratitude. Gratitude for what we shared when it was good. Gratitude for the hard ending that woke me up. Gratitude for the silence that forced me to listen inward. I never sent it. It lived in my drawer beneath bills and spare keys. It didn't need to reach her. It had already done its job, given me peace. Seasons began to change. Winter receded, the air softened, mornings arrived earlier. Life moved on gently but surely. I reconnected with old friends. Made a few new ones, said yes to invitations I would have once declined. I wasn't looking for anything, but I also wasn't hiding anymore. Healing isn't a finish line. It's a process, a rhythm you learn. Some days you dance, some days you stumble, but eventually you move forward. There were still echoes, triggers. Occasionally I'd see someone from behind and think it was her. Or I'd overhear a voice and feel my stomach twist. But those moments passed quicker now. Like clouds, not anchors, I let them float. My apartment became a home. I bought plants, art. A rug I didn't need but liked. I hosted a few dinners, not extravagant, just enough to fill the space with laughter and the clink of glasses. It was new laughter, unattached, simple. In the quiet before sleep, I no longer feared the stillness. I welcomed it. I saw it for what it was, a mirror. And for the first time in years, I could look into that mirror and see a man. Not shattered, not hardened, but whole. Not because he'd found someone new, but because he'd found himself. And that, I think, was the real story. Not the betrayal, not the yoga coach, not the video that shattered my illusions. But the slow, deliberate reclamation of self. No one prepares you for how much strength it takes to let go of a life you spent years building. But the freedom that follows, that breathless, terrifying, beautiful freedom, is worth every cracked foundation, every broken frame. I was no longer waiting for closure. I was no longer chasing explanations. I was no longer haunted by questions she never answered. I was just here, breathing, becoming. There was a morning when I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about her in days. Not a memory. Not an echo, not even a flicker of resentment. The realization didn't come with fireworks or some dramatic swell of music. It was quiet, almost anticlimactic. But it meant everything. Healing, I had come to learn, doesn't announce itself. It just slips in one morning when the light hits the wall a little softer, and the silence in the room no longer feels like punishment. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the birds that had returned to the city with spring. It had been a long winter, not just in weather but in the soul, and now, for the first time, I didn't feel like I was merely surviving it. I was on the other side of something, and I was still standing. Time has a strange way of smoothing over the jagged edges of pain. It doesn't erase them, but it sands them down just enough so they no longer draw blood. There were moments, earlier in the process, when I was sure I'd carry the sting of betrayal forever, that it would follow me like a scar, visible or not. But now, that feeling had dulled into something else, something closer to perspective. The truth was simple, really. She had been a chapter, a long, complex, sometimes beautiful chapter, but not the whole story. And once I accepted that, everything changed. I began traveling again, not to escape but to explore. I took a train up the coast one weekend with no real plan. Just a bag, a journal, and the willingness to be uncomfortable in unfamiliar places. I stayed in small towns, ate alone in diners, watched waves crash against empty beaches. I struck up conversations with strangers, each one unknowingly handing me a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. There was something profoundly humbling about anonymity. No one knew who I had been. No one expected anything. I was just a man with tired eyes and a calm demeanor, drinking black coffee and asking about local trails. It was in those quiet exchanges that I began to truly inhabit the freedom I'd fought so hard for. Freedom, I discovered, isn't loud. It's not a rebellion or a victory lap. It's the absence of noise. The end of pretending. It's waking up without dread. It's making choices because you want to, not because you're reacting to someone else's chaos. It's looking in the mirror and not needing to flinch. I returned home after a few weeks, sunburned and softened. My apartment greeted me like an old friend, plants still alive. Light still spilling through the same windows, everything in its place. But I had changed, and the space somehow knew it. I started saying yes to things I used to avoid. Dinner with friends, a poetry reading, a weekend hiking trip with people I barely knew. I no longer feared stillness or unfamiliarity. I welcomed them. They were signs of movement, of life reshaping itself around me. Not without her, but without the parts of me I had lost for her. There were occasional reminders, of course. A mutual acquaintance would mention her in passing. A place we once visited would show up on my feed. Her name would float by in conversations not meant for me, but they no longer pierced me. They barely touched the surface. Like shadows cast on water, they were there and then they were. One day, a letter arrived. It was from her. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Her handwriting hadn't changed, still neat, still intentional. I braced myself for anger, or manipulation, or one final twist of the knife, but it wasn't any of those things. It was an apology, a real one, not filled with justifications or half-truths, but something simpler, cleaner. She acknowledged the betrayal, the lies, the cowardice. She admitted she didn't expect to fall for someone else, but that she also hadn't fought very hard not to. She said she admired how I had handled the aftermath, that I had given her more grace than she deserved, and she asked nothing in return. There was no postscript, no hint of rekindling, just closure. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the drawer where the unsigned letter I once wrote to her still lived. And then I walked to the balcony, stood under the open sky, and let the breeze wash over me. I wasn't angry, I wasn't sad, I wasn't even relieved. I was just done. That's when I realized, closure isn't a door someone else can open for you. It's a decision you make. To stop standing in the doorway of a past that no longer needs your witness. To walk forward, even if your legs still remember the weight of what once was. I started teaching part-time at a community center, not for income but for joy. Writing workshops, men's support groups. People came with wounds and stories and silence, and I recognized all of it. Not because I had answers, but because I had lived it too. We shared coffee, poems, pain. And in that shared space, I found more healing than I ever had in solitude. There was one man, younger than me, who reminded me of myself. Tight-lipped, composed, unraveling slowly. He stayed after class once, lingered while stacking chairs. I didn't press him. I just waited. Eventually, he asked, "How do you forgive someone who broke everything you gave them?" I thought about it for a while, and I said, by realizing they can't take what was truly yours. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? She had taken love, trust, years, but she hadn't taken me. She hadn't taken my ability to hope, to build again, to open, to give, to write, to live. She hadn't taken the fire that made me a man in the first place. She had only taken my silence, and now I had that voice back. As I write this now, the sun is setting outside my window. The light catches the edge of the bookshelf. The air smells like rain even though the sky is clear. Somewhere in the city, people are falling in love, betraying each other, beginning again. That's what life does. It loops, it spirals, it heals in circles. And me. I'm not waiting anymore. Not for apologies, not for justice, not for time to prove anything. I have nothing to prove. I have stories to write, miles to walk, kindness to offer. And when love comes again, and I know quietly that it will, I won't meet it with fear. I'll meet it with everything I've learned about staying, about leaving, about becoming. But for now, I have myself. And for the first time in a long time, that is more than enough.